Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to Bhagavad-gita Satsang. I'm Hari-kirtana, and as always, it is a great honor for me to have you here with me and a great pleasure for me to be here with you. It's so nice to see so many of you again, and some of you who appear to be here for the first time. So thank you very, very much for being here. We'll take care of a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Our usual first order of business, please avail yourself to the little raise here. Oh, Annie, you're so far ahead of me. Bonnie, thank you very much. Yes. Okay, so this is the proof that I can be heard. That's always very nice. Apparently, I'm assuming that I can be seen as well. Some of you maybe who have been following the satsang for some time may be wondering about what you're seeing. Specifically, you're seeing hair that is usually not there. And there's two reasons, of course, for that is just timing. My barber is not getting anywhere near anyone, and I suppose that's probably for the best. But also, it's the beginning of April, and every year around this time, right about the beginning of April, I developed the urge to start doing an impersonation of Charlton Heston from the Ten Commandments. So this is what I'm working on here. It's just that time of year. It's also time for me to share my screen once again so we can take care of some other housekeeping business. Let's see if we can do that. Okay, so for those of you who are new to the satsang, you can adjust your audio settings and your viewing options, probably up in the upper right-hand corner, perhaps down in the lower left-hand corner. It's your experience, I don't know. Either way, you need not worry about your mic or your video camera. I cannot see or hear you unless you type something into the chat window, and that way I know I have amused at least some of the audience, or I can see your comments, questions, and reflections. You can also pop a question into the Q&A. I also have that open. And that's how that all works. We are in chapter 18, the Yoga of Perfect Renunciation. Last time, we covered how to achieve freedom from karma, yoga and social distancing, and we got started with letting go of obstacles. The bad news is we didn't finish what I'd planned. The good news is the reason is because we had so many nice questions and things to discuss, and I encourage all of you to please see to it that I once again do not finish the verses that I intend to cover on account of your questions and comments and points of discussion. So please feel free. This evening, we will finish up, to be sure, with letting go of obstacles and move on to the greatest secret, how to know Krishna, and our choice, spiritual or material consciousness. We will endeavor to cover verses 52 through 60. And before we do, as is our usual practice, we will chant our invocation mantra. So a quick introduction to transliterated Sanskrit for those of you who are relatively new. A dot over an M indicates that in addition to closing our lips in front, as we normally would with an M, we also will close the back of our tongue to the roof of our mouth. Making a very round shape with our mouth so the sound comes out of our jaw as well as out from between our lips. A bar over a vowel indicates an open and elongated version of that vowel without a bar, a short and stubbier version of that vowel. In this case, an ah sound with the bar over an A and an sound without the bar over the A. And with that, I will chant this mantra, and I'll chant it 3 times. You are welcome, if you like, to chant it back. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Translation: I offer my respects to the Supreme Person, the Son of Vasudeva, who is the all-pervading transcendence. Vasudeva, having a double meaning, meaning that which is all-pervading, and also a patronymic, the son of Vasudeva, who is Krishna, the speaker of the Bhagavad-gita. Last week, we covered a cluster of verses that go together, verses 51 through 53, actually. We got into 51 and 52. So here's what we got into. Being purified by one's intelligence and controlling the mind with determination, giving up the objects of sense gratification, being freed from attachment and hatred, one who lives in a secluded place. So that last line is the first line of verse 52. So in connection with this verse, we spoke about how the key to controlling the mind is to control the senses, because the mind is the reservoir of the senses. And the Yoga-sutras of Patanjali, in the second chapter, or pada, which is about the actions of yoga, as opposed to how to simply renounce everything and sit in meditation, offers us a moral philosophy in the form of the yamas and the niyamas, the ethical guidelines and personal observances. And we spoke about how they are meant to discourage the pursuit of happiness through the pleasures of the senses for selfish reasons, and associate real happiness with the awakening of spiritual senses that comes about through the purification of the mind and senses. And then we experience ourselves as we truly are, and it just so happens that we are joyful by our very nature. Therefore, real sustainable happiness actually comes from the experience of the true nature of the self. Then, picking up where we left off, one who eats lightly, who controls their body, mind, and power of speech, who is constantly absorbed in the yoga of meditation, and who has taken shelter of detachment. So this is the rest of 52. And let's take a closer look at this verse. So one who eats little, that is to say, eats for the sake of keeping body and soul together. A yogi is not a foodie who indulges the palate, but is rather someone who takes a simple, healthy, natural diet for the sake of maintaining the gift of the material body, who considers that this body is a special opportunity for self-realization and is also not our property. That is to say, we are renters, not owners, and we have an obligation to take good care of this material body. We're going to come back to this idea of proprietorship a little bit later. The yogic standard for food intake is filling 1/3 of your belly with food, 1/3 of your belly with water, and leaving 1/3 of your belly with air. And in this way, one maintains a very healthy standard of digestion, ease of, it makes it easy for your body to process whatever we put into it. One who controls their mind, their body, their mind, and their power of speech. So the correct understanding of mindfulness, as far as the Gita is concerned, is to always engage one's body in the actions of yoga, to always engage one's mind and one's mind in the actions of yoga, the mental actions of yoga, and one's speech in service to the project of self-realization for oneself and for others. That is to say, one doesn't waste one's time with trivial pursuits or mundane conversation. It doesn't mean you don't discuss the news of the day, but that you discuss the news of the day in relationship to the bigger spiritual context in which mundane events take place in order to understand them. I've mentioned, I think, a couple of times that I lamented to a mentor, a friend of mine, that I spent too much time reading the New York Times, not enough time reading the Bhagavad-gita. This was many years ago. And he said, actually, I read the New York Times in order to understand the Bhagavad-gita. So in this way, we can dovetail our propensity to engage with the world and know what's going on in the world so that it becomes a vehicle for understanding transcendental knowledge and how the world works in a spiritual context. Then, who is constantly absorbed in the yoga of meditation. This translates the phrase Jnāna yoga paro nityam. So dhyana, meditation, yoga, union, paro nityam. Nitya means always, eternal. So perpetually absorbed in trance or constant devotion to union with the divine through the ceaseless meditation on the divine. And this idea of perpetual meditation is going to come up in the next few verses as well. And then finally, vairagyam samupashritaha, taking shelter of detachment. So this is kind of an interesting phrase that Krishna uses here, taking shelter of detachment, having some constructive distance from the material world. I mean, you know, if we're just in the material world and invested in the material world, then we can get pretty beat up because the material world is not actually a very safe place, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. Psychologically, it's just rough. Physically, it can be rough. Emotionally, draining. So our compassionate detachment, which is not the same as indifference, becomes a kind of shelter, gives us a safe spiritual space from which to deal with the world. So I would like to encourage you to consider this idea that detachment can be a form of shelter. And it's not indifference, it's not denial, it's not spiritual bypassing. It's the cultivation of an authentic ability to see the forest instead of just the trees. So that takes us to the end of verse 52 from last week. And if you have any questions or comments about that, go ahead and pop those in the chat. Meanwhile, I'm going to finish up verse 53 to get us caught up. So moving to verse 53. See this clever thing that I did? I highlighted each of these phrases that I just spoke about, and then completely forgot that I did that. You know, it's possible that I did it in the next verse too. Let's just see. Free from false ego, false strength, false pride, lust, anger, and acceptance of material things, having been delivered from a false sense of proprietorship and peaceful, such a person is certainly elevated to the position of self-realization. So in this verse, Krishna basically finishes his list of all the characteristics that one develops from the yoga system. And at this point, he's talking about karma yoga, then karma yoga that's informed by jnana, by knowledge, and then evolves to mystic yoga, or the yoga that is presented in the Yoga-sutras of Patanjali. And we'll start with freedom from false ego. Oh, look, I did do that in this verse, and I actually remembered. Krishna earlier said that he is the source of remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. So the temptation would be to blame Krishna for my forgetting that I did this in the previous verse. But if I do that, then because he's the source of remembrance, I have to give him credit for my remembering that I did it in this verse. So, you know, that sword cuts both ways. Egoism, the second obstacle to yoga that we want to relinquish or overcome. I think relinquishing or being delivered from these things, letting them go, is a better way to think about this, because yoga is a subtractive process. Our natural state of being is one of pure consciousness. And all this other stuff, these are all artificial ingredients that get in the way of our experience of our true nature. So to let go of or free oneself from these artificial ingredients, like the false ego, which is the false identity composed of the qualities of material nature that we've acquired or become entangled with due to karmic reactions, reactions to past actions. The false ego is that identity that we have acquired and become attached to. So freedom from that false sense of identity. Then false strength, false pride, false everything. The illusion of independence from the ultimate source of strength. And thinking that one is the one who accomplishes things. Krishna earlier in the Gita says, I am the strength of the strong, devoid of passion and desire. That's back in the 7th chapter, verse 11. And pride, lust, and anger consistently show up as qualities Krishna deems, frankly, demonic. They are in the mode of passion and ignorance, and therefore to be avoided. Lust, anger, and greed are characterized as the 3 gates to hell, and therefore obviously should be avoided by someone who doesn't want to live in a hellish condition of life. Having been delivered from a false sense of proprietorship. The acceptance of material things. I forgot about that. So acceptance of material things has 2 implications here. One, the sense of clinging to material acquisitions, stuff. And then the second is thinking that material life is all there is. There's nothing further to be aspired to than this, happiness in this material world. So understanding that there's more to life than the acquisition of stuff, it's not a matter of whoever has the most stuff at the end wins. And understanding that the material world is a phenomenon that takes place within a much bigger and more significant spiritual context. Then, having been delivered from a false sense of proprietorship, back in the 13th chapter, Krishna describes his expansion, the Param Atma, the supreme soul within the heart of all souls, as the supreme proprietor of everything. We are only secondary proprietors of this body and whatever else we may happen to appear to possess. Whereas Krishna, as Bhagavan, the supreme person, or the person who is complete in all opulences, the possessor of all wealth, all strength, all knowledge, all beauty, all fame, all renunciation. Krishna is the ultimate proprietor of everything because, there's nothing but Krishna and Krishna's energies insofar as the Bhagavad-gita is concerned. And therefore, Krishna is the ultimate proprietor of his energies. Anything that we have is made up of Krishna's energies. Whoops. And then, hey. And peaceful. The last item here. So letting go of all the baggage of material consciousness, all this stuff that we've just listed in these last three verses, 51, 52, and 53, letting go of all that stuff with the understanding that we don't actually need it and it doesn't even belong to us anyway, actually that's peacefulness. When you can just stop carrying the luggage of your false ego around, the baggage of like your whole material project, what a relief that is. And that's how one becomes peaceful, by letting go of the obstacles to yoga. So this sets us up now for the next set of verses, wherein Krishna will begin his summary of the greatest secret, how to know him personally. In other words, Krishna is going to tell us how we can meet God face to face, which is a pretty far out secret, hence the greatest secret. So before we move into this next set of verses, 54 through 60, I will inquire once again if you have any questions, comments, reflections, or realizations about letting go of these obstacles to yoga. So please go ahead and pop something in the chat if you like. And I'm going to read through all of the verses that we are officially covering for this week that are designated as our verses for this week. I'm just going to read through the English translations. We have a couple of verses that I hope to chant with you this evening. And then we'll go back and chant the verses that we're highlighting and take a look at each of these verses individually and go a little bit deeper into them. So, beginning with verse 54, one who is thus united with absolute reality, whose self is serene, who neither despairs nor desires, and who is equally disposed toward all living beings, in that state one attains supreme devotion to me. Verse 55, by offering one's love to me, one can recognize me and know the full measure of who I truly am. Upon knowing me in truth, one immediately returns to me. Verse 56, though continually engaged in all manner of activities, under my protection and by my grace, one attains my eternal and imperishable abode. 57. Thinking of all activities as an offering to me, being completely devoted to me, taking shelter of spiritual intelligence, always be conscious of me. 58. If you become conscious of me, you will pass over all the obstacles of conditioned life by my grace. If, however, you do not work in such consciousness, but act through false ego, not hearing me, you will be lost. 59. If you do not act according to my direction and do not fight, then you will be falsely directed. By your nature, you will have to be engaged in warfare. And 60. O son of Kunti, that which, due to illusion, you do not wish to do, you will be compelled to do by your own nature. So the verses here come in kind of two sets. The first set is the greatest secret, how to know Krishna. Then the second set is, what's the alternative? That is to say, what will happen if we opt for material consciousness rather than follow Krishna's guidelines that he's offering us for developing spiritual consciousness? So let's take a look at verse 54. So we'll chant this verse together this evening, and we'll take a little closer look at the diacritics, the pronunciation cues that we find in the Sanskrit that is presented to us in the Roman alphabet. We pronounce each letter that we see, so an H after a consonant just gets some air after it. The long vowel I've already explained. So with a U, that's an oo sound as opposed to a sound. But even without the bar across the top, the U is more of an oo sound as opposed to an sound. An sound would be an A without a bar. A dot under an H at the end of a word indicates a short stop on the vowel that precedes it, unless that dot under the H at the end of a word also appears at the end of a line, which does not occur in this particular verse. Do ends together mean you just spend a little extra time on the ends. An accent mark over an S is an SH sound, but an SH sound deep in the back of one's mouth, so all the way back by the hinge of your jaw. So you're going to curl your tongue back, make the sound from all the way back here, as opposed to a dot under an S, which is a regular SH sound that's going to come out from behind your teeth. Shh. Let's see, what else we got here? Okay, that should cover it. So I will chant each line, and if you like, you can chant each line back. Here we go. Brahma bhuta prasannatma na shochati na kangshati sama sarveshu bhuteshu madbhaktin labhate param. Translation once again, one who is thus united with absolute reality, whose self is serene, who neither despairs nor desires, and who is equally disposed toward all living beings. In that state, one attains supreme devotion to me. And did I highlight the words in this verse? No, I did not. So I will come back in my manifestation of a full screen person and tell you that Brahma Bhuta is the phrase that means united with absolute reality. So in this case, Brahma means Brahman, being, sometimes this is translated as merging into Brahman, becoming one with Brahman or one with the absolute, as opposed to Brahma, the demigod with four heads. So this is the first interesting part of this verse is that the state beyond identifying the self as being the body and the mind, and this place of liberation beyond karmic reactions, is called Brahma Bhuta, being merged into Brahman, being united with the spiritual substratum of reality. And for the Jnana yogis, the yogis who, by practice of studying the Vedas and meditation, see this merging into the undifferentiated oneness of absolute reality as the end-all and be-all of yogic practice. And that's one way to look at it. But that is not what the Bhagavad-gita is telling us. There's a difference between becoming Brahman in the literal sense of merging one's existence impersonally into absolute reality, and being situated in Brahman as a spiritual individual who is therefore capable of serving para Brahman, or the paramount Brahman, the supreme person, and engaging in a relationship of love, an exchange of love with the supreme person, which is what the bhakti yogis consider to be the end-all and be-all of yogic practice. The engagement with the supreme person on the platform of transcendence, or pure consciousness engaged in pure devotional service without any taint of mental speculation or the desire to get some material benefit. So Brahman realization, or liberation, from the standpoint of what Krishna is teaching us in the Bhagavad-gita, is the starting point of pure devotional service on the spiritual platform, and not necessarily the end-all and be-all of self-realization or spiritual existence. So here's the flip side of that. One who is engaged in bhakti yoga, or devotional service to the supreme person, is already, in a sense, in a state of liberation. Because certainly there is oneness with the absolute in terms of oneness of purpose. There's the recognition of the oneness of quality. That is to say, we have the same spiritual quality as the supreme person, but just not in the same quantity. The supreme person is the sum total of all existence and the summum bonum, the ultimate good. We, by contrast, are an infinitesimal part of this infinite, complete reality. And as parts, it is our spiritual nature to express love for the whole through service to the whole, and feel the loving reciprocation of the whole for all of the parts. If you merge completely and literally into absolute oneness, there's no possibility of a relationship of love or any other kind, nor is there the possibility of rendering any service, which, according to the devotional philosophy of Vedic culture, is a natural aptitude of a spiritual person. You know, the reason that we are always engaged here in the material world in service of one kind or another, and get a greater level of satisfaction from being of service to those we love, as opposed to accepting service from those who love us, is because that's a spiritual quality. And that spiritual quality blossoms into its ultimate fulfillment on the spiritual platform. So in the conception of absolute reality, there's no difference, and yet there is a difference. There's simultaneously oneness and difference. The oneness is the qualitative spiritual unity And the difference is what facilitates the relationship between eternal individuals, which was established all the way back in the second chapter, where Krishna spoke to Arjuna about how we are eternally existing, and therefore our individuality is on the spiritual level, not just on this material bodily level. And that individuality is what allows us to have spiritual relationships. So that was the first element, Brahma-bhuta prasanatma, one who is united with absolute reality, and then one whose self is serene and who neither despairs nor desires, and is equally disposed towards all living beings. So this is spiritual vision, equanimity toward all living entities, while recognizing material distinctions. Equal does not mean same. So compassion is expressed equally to all beings, but differently according to our good judgment of time, place, and circumstance. So on the one hand, one sees stone and gold as being the same, having the same value for one's personal aspirations. You just don't care. But you also understand that if you were going to engage in some spiritual activity on the material level, you'll use stone to, say, build a temple, and gold to pay the workers in case you don't want to build it yourself. I know I don't, because I just don't have that kind of aptitude. And it would just be better if I paid somebody else to do it. Back in the 6th chapter, where Krishna is describing the yoga process, that is to say, Jnāna yoga, the yoga of the Yoga-sutras, he tells us that one who is spiritually situated by virtue of both acquired knowledge, jnana, book knowledge, and realized knowledge, vijnana, who has conquered the senses and who sees a clump of earth, a common stone, or gold as being of equal value, that person is fixed in yoga. Still more advanced is one who sees well-wishing friends, kind-hearted benefactors, enemies, disinterested parties, neutral mediators, the saintly and the sinful, all through a lens of steady intelligence. This is buddhi yoga, or spiritual intelligence. That is, you see every living being as spiritually equal, even though they have manifested in varieties of life forms. So that finishes up verse 54. Any questions, comments, reflections on that verse? Please share them with me while I anxiously await your questions and comments. We are going to also chant the next verse. We are in that section of the Gita where practically every verse is a super important verse, because this is the part of the Gita where Krishna is bringing it all home. And therefore, every single verse is just kind of a super verse. So let's see what we've got here by way of diacritics. Same as before, you may recall in the last verse, I pointed out that a dot under an H at the end of a word at the end of the line means that instead of a short stop on the vowel that precedes the H, we echo a short version of that vowel back. So that's just a placement difference. A tilde over an N is a nya sound. So you're going to take about 2/3 of the way back of your tongue up to 2/3 of the way onto the roof of your mouth and put a little Y kind of body English on that N, nya. When a J precedes one of those tilted N's, then it stops being a J sound and becomes more of a G sound, a G, hard G sound. And when you put them together, it becomes gya. And, a C is always a CH sound. And it's a CH sound from the middle of your mouth, ka. So you're going to curl your tongue back towards the back of the roof of your mouth, as opposed to bringing the sound out of the front of your mouth. So instead of cha from behind your teeth, it's ka. It's a little fuller part of your mouth that gets used. And with that, I will once again chant each line. And if you like, you can chant each line back. Bhaktya mam abhijhanati yavan yashasmi tattvataha tato mam tattvato gyatva vishate tad anantaram. Translation once again. By offering one's love to me, one can recognize and know the full measure of who I truly am. Upon knowing me in truth, one immediately returns to me. So this is a pretty far out idea here, because there are plenty of famous people in the world that are famous somewhere else, and if you saw them, you might not recognize them. Whereas someone who actually has some frame of reference for this person, they would immediately say, oh, very famous person. When we were coming back from India on our last trip in February, we were waiting online for, I guess it was a domestic flight from Bhubaneswar to Delhi, I think. And, it was a fairly long line. And a woman came up, looked at the line disapprovingly, and then just walked into the center of the line, cutting ahead of half the line. We were one of the few foreigners in the line because it was a domestic flight. And we looked at her, and we looked at each other, and we said, I guess she must be very important. And the guy behind us said, oh, yes, she is. She's like a famous celebrity. And then she noticed that he came to her defense, which gave him an opportunity to kind of fawn over her and, I'm not worthy and everything that went with that. So we didn't recognize her. So similarly, the Supreme Person might walk right by you on the street, and because you don't have the requisite qualification, you might not recognize the Supreme Person. Here, Krishna is telling us that he becomes visible to his devotee by his own potency. He reveals himself. It's not by the force of one's yoga practice that the Supreme Being is obliged to reveal himself, but rather it's a revelation by grace. It's not ascension by metaphysical effort. It's not something you can mentally speculate your way to. Back in the 7th chapter, Krishna tells us that he does not reveal himself to everyone. This is the 25th verse in the 7th chapter. He says, being hidden by my divine power of illusion, this bewildered world doesn't recognize me, who am unborn and infallible. The one most obvious thing to all of us should be the omnipresence of the Supreme Person. But because our spiritual senses are covered by matter, we don't see the Supreme Person. And even if Krishna showed up, we wouldn't necessarily recognize him because he wouldn't allow us to see who he was unless we had the qualification, which is that we offer our love to him. And I think all of us can understand this completely, because who do we reveal ourselves to? Not just anybody. We reveal ourselves to the people we trust. Who do we trust? The people who love us, the people whom we feel their love for us. Krishna is a person. We're people. We can understand something about Krishna by studying ourselves. This is part of Swadhyaya, self-study. We understand ourselves, but because we're infinitesimal parts of an infinite complete whole that also has the attribute of being a person, which is where our personness comes from, we can understand the Supreme Person. So upon knowing, one can know the full measure of who Krishna really is. So this particular edition of Bhagavad-gita as it is, has a great index. And part of that index is a very, very long listing of Krishna as. See all these like 3 columns? This is all where you'll find different descriptions of Krishna as the basis of everything, as the basis of Brahman, as beginning, middle, and end of all beings, as beginningless, as butter in sacrifice, as the cause of all causes, as the charioteer of Arjuna, as death personified, as the enjoyer of sacrifices, as equal to all, as the eternal seed, as the source of equanimity, as the fire of digestion, as the fragrance of the earth, as the Gayatri mantra, as the gambling of cheats, as healing herbs, etc., etc., etc. So this gives you just an indication of the full measure of Krishna, which we can know by Krishna's revelation of himself to us, which he's inclined to do if we are dedicated to the project of cultivating love, a relationship with Krishna. So Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotional service, constitutes the activity of a liberated person. And one who directly engages in Bhakti Yoga automatically attains liberation because Bhakti Yoga itself is on the transcendental platform. It's spiritual engagement with the supreme spiritual person, and is therefore the most efficient and joyful way to purify one's consciousness. There's a Sanskrit word in this verse, vishate. One enters or one becomes manifest, and it's often interpreted or translated as meaning to merge into Krishna rather than to enter into Krishna's world. So vishate, in the sense of bhakti, means to enter into the abode of the Supreme Person as an individual in order to have the pleasure of his company. The example that's given here is like a parrot, a green bird, can fly into a tree that is green. Its leaves are all green. And it appears to merge into the tree. But actually, it hasn't become one with the tree. It's entering into the tree in order to enjoy the fruits on the tree. So similarly, this word vishate can be understood to mean entering into the spiritual realm as a pure spiritual person in order to enjoy spiritual relationships, and specifically a spiritual relationship with the basis of Brahman, or the absolute spiritual reality, Krishna. Which brings us now to verse 56, where he's going to finish up this thought. In 56 and 57, he tells us basically, once again, how you do this. So he says, though continually engaged in all manner of activities, so either in the material world or in the spiritual world, doesn't matter, under my protection and by my grace, one attains my eternal and imperishable abode. So, by acting in such a way as to invoke Krishna's shelter and grace, we live in transcendence even while living in the material world. So it's not just a matter of obey the rules in this world and get a reward in the next. It's not quite like that, because sometimes this verse can sound like that for those of us who are accustomed to thinking in terms of Western religion. So it's not be good now, get a reward later, but rather, if one is living a spiritual life in relationship with Krishna right now in the material world and acting in such a way as to request or inspire Krishna to give us the protection that we seek and open up his world for us to enter into, then that starts to happen here and now. So this is a confirmation that there is activity in transcendence, that being unchanging doesn't mean to be static. Changeless means there's no fluctuation of identity, because we have a constant spiritual, eternal spiritual identity, but that identity is dynamic. So one who is fully engaged in spiritual activity without interruption is protected by Krishna in all circumstances. The Sanskrit phrase here for that is mad vyapashraya. So ashraya, shelter, under my protection. Mud means mine. So under all circumstances, easy, difficult, whatever. In the next verse, he says, thinking of all activities as an offering to me. So here, earlier in the Gita, Krishna described how he is the ultimate beneficiary of sacrifices, of offerings. And, if you're cultivating a relationship with love for someone, then you want to offer them things they like. And so, throughout the Gita, Krishna has expressed equanimity and evenness to all, and yet he's got preferences because he's a person. And his preference is activities that are in the mode of goodness and transcend the modes of material nature altogether, the three gunas, goodness, passion, and ignorance. So we can look back on the Gita and see what does Krishna like? What does Krishna advise us to do in such a way that he will accept that which we have to offer and be pleased by that which we have to offer? That's what it means to be completely devoted. And that's the next phrase in this verse, being completely devoted to me, taking shelter of spiritual intelligence. So this is another taking shelter. Before we were taking shelter of detachment. Well, how does compassionate detachment come about? By spiritual intelligence. This is the phrase buddhi yogam. So how does one acquire spiritual intelligence? One acts according to the direction of Krishna in the Bhagavad-gita. The Bhagavad-gita is spoken for the sake of guiding us on the path of spiritual intelligence. And while we are working in this way, based on spiritual intelligence, Krishna is advising us to always be conscious of him. He says, always be conscious of me. So in whatever action one is undertaking, the underlying consciousness is consciousness of Krishna. Annie, let's see what you got here. So by merging with Krishna, you are not losing everything and losing yourself. Rather, you are gaining everything and gaining God. This is a really good question. So let me sort this out in a little more detail. If we merge with Krishna to the point that we lose our own individual identity and just disappear into Krishna, there's no possibility of a relationship with Krishna. It is not possible to become Krishna. It's not that you're not losing everything in losing yourself because you're gaining everything in gaining God. Yeah, I want to make sure I have the right context for your question. By gaining God, we have everything because God is and has everything. Anything that we could possibly desire or hope to bring us happiness, God can do that. That goes with the territory of being God. So by giving up our own sense of proprietorship, our own sense of being the one who is the director of things and making things happen, by losing that false sense of identity, we don't lose anything because it's all false. It has a kind of lesser reality. It's valid. These are valid experiences that we're having, but these experiences are of a lesser reality on account of it being illusory. That is to say, temporary and changing and bringing about alternating happiness and distress. You're gaining everything when we regain our awareness of our eternal spiritual identity in relationship to God. The mistake people make, I don't think that's what you're talking about here, but the mistake people make is that we think that we can become God by merging into God. And the merger is one of shared spiritual quality and shared interest. So in that way, oneness. I hope that answers your question. I have another one from Shana. Okay, so if our identity is false, then wouldn't we lose that identity in developing a relationship with Krishna and hence not being what we think of as ourselves anymore? Yeah, actually. To the extent that we are able to let go of our misidentified self, that is to say, the false ego, that identity falls away in favor of our eternal spiritual nature. Because remember, the false ego is a misidentification. But is that different from ceasing to be a separate being? Ah, there you go. No. The being we think we are is not the being that we are. The being that we think we are will change, even in this life, what to speak of when this body is finished. We will eventually reach the end of our allotted time in this body, and over the course of a lifetime, the sense of identity morphs from one sense of identity to another sense of identity, and then the subtle body of mind, intelligence, and false ego, the pranic body, and all the other metaphysical bodies beneath this food body act as the transport medium to our next body. To be cognizant of one's eternal spiritual identity doesn't mean that you cease to be an individual. So you don't no one loses their sense of being a separate person by entering into a spiritual atmosphere when one is cognizant of Krishna as a person and oneself as a person. One can, from the standpoint of bhakti yoga, commit a kind of spiritual suicide by merging into Brahmanda, or the oneness of Brahman. A friend of mine characterized this in an article in a magazine on bhakti recently as, the equivalent of a spiritual coma. You're free from suffering, you're liberated from your karma, but you have, for all intents and purposes, lost the dynamic nature of your spiritual essence and are quiescent, static. The devotional yogi has no desire for this merging or losing one's sense of spiritual identity. Now, while we're still embodied in the material world, we'll still have certain characteristics that some people will find charming and some people will find obnoxious. And that's just playing out the string of our karma insofar as what the qualities of material nature present to us as what we appear to be. But someone who's advanced in yoga doesn't have any particular attachment anymore for that sense of identity. So it's there, but we don't cling to it. One who's really advanced experiences a kind of healthy schizophrenia. Their inner life, one is fully awake to their spiritual identity. Their outer life, one's still engaged in the material world. Such a person is called a jivan muktaha, one who is liberated and experiencing transcendence within while still walking around the material world. Does that answer your question? And while I wait for you to let me know if I've got that, I'm going to look back up. It says, Annie has a follow-up. I have always feared that becoming one with God would mean annihilation. I know that is the ego fearing extinction, but what is left of the individual person? So you become your true authentic self, ? Yes, that's correct. So to become one with God, in a very literal sense of merging into the undifferentiated oneness of Brahman, would in fact be a kind of spiritual annihilation, not just a matter of your ego being afraid of dying, which it would, and the mind's job is to defend the ego, and therefore your mind certainly is going to object to this idea of merging with God. But it's also a kind of spiritual extinction or annihilation as well, because you really have just consciousness of your own consciousness, but there's nothing going on. You don't get to express your spiritual identity. So you become your true authentic self. Yes, you do. And that true authentic self has an identity that is simply unknown to us when our spiritual senses have been turned off or covered over by the qualities of material nature that make us who we appear to be in a state of illusion. So uncovering the true characteristic of our eternal spiritual identity is the process of yoga as far as the bhakti yogi is concerned. And our eternal individuality is established in our own consciousness. Krishna, of course, is already aware of this. So I hope that allays your fear of extinction by entering into the spiritual atmosphere that Krishna is describing here, and affirms that you have a true, authentic spiritual self that is sleeping and is just waiting for the alarm clock of mantra meditation to wake you up. All right. Let me come back. Shana, yes, I sort of get it and sort of don't, but I think it's the kind of thing that requires understanding over time. Yes, we hear that uninterrupted practice over a long period of time is what's required in order to bring about a complete understanding, an experiential understanding of this stuff. Practice over time is apparently what I need in order to get through all of my intended verses in a single hour, which for the third time in a row, I see that I have failed to do. And Shani, you're right. It's not possible to fully understand this stuff on an intellectual level. It requires the awakening of spiritual senses. That is to say, beyond just an intellectual conception, Jnāna, one has to act in such a way as to purify the senses so that it becomes experiential, realized knowledge. And that's what the actions of yoga are meant to facilitate, to get us beyond Jnāna, book knowledge, theoretical knowledge, and into the realm of realization, Vijnāna, experiential knowledge. So, yeah, you are right. Full understanding requires taking the direction that Krishna is giving us here, insofar as how to act in the material world in order to spiritualize our existence. So Jill, more classes for us? Well, you know, I got a plan. I've given myself a little bit of room so that even if I don't finish my planned number of verses in a given evening, I will still get to the end on time somehow. It'll be a miracle. The next 3 verses that I didn't get a chance to cover this evening actually go together. And they are going to be what you get when you take Krishna's advice, which is his opinion of what we should do and not a commandment. And what you get if you don't, if you opt for material consciousness rather than spiritual consciousness. So with that, I am going to modify the plan for next time to include the last bullet point that I hope to cover this evening. Our choice, spiritual or material consciousness, is where we will actually begin. We did manage to finish up letting go of obstacles, and we covered the greatest secret, how to know Krishna. So, last call for questions. We're already a little over, and I'm very grateful for the fact that you have, so many of you have stuck around beyond our usual end point. If you have questions after the fact, or if you are watching this after the fact, then you can send me your questions, hari@hari-kirtana.com. I will always be very, very happy to hear from you, and I will reply to your questions and comments and reflections as soon as I possibly can. Very welcome, Joelle. Next week, we will finish up with these last 3 verses that we didn't completely cover this evening. Then we will speak about the Supreme Director, Krishna, and we will reach the crescendo of the Bhagavad-gita. So this is where the actual high point of the Bhagavad-gita will appear, and with it the crown jewel of transcendental knowledge that Krishna is offering us in the Bhagavad-gita. We will, I promise you, cover verses 61 through 66 next week. And now I have to make good on my promise because, yeah, I just promised. All righty. Annie, you're very welcome. It's my pleasure to answer your questions to the best of my ability. I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to hear your questions and do my best to respond to them. Shana, thank you very much. Sarah, thank you for being here. It's always a great pleasure to spend this time with you. And I'm particularly honored that you stuck around for a few extra minutes after the fact. So I hope to see you all again next time. Emily, you're very welcome. And with that, I will end this meeting for all. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. Good night.